The envelope arrived 3 days after the avalanche buried the northern pass beneath 20 feet of snow. Elias found it waiting outside his apartment door without a stamp, address, or sender. Across the brittle paper, someone had written his full name in faded black ink that looked disturbingly old. He carried the envelope inside, while the storm outside rattled the windows like restless fingers. The apartment suddenly felt colder the moment he touched the cracked red seal. When he opened it, a sharp smell of damp earth drifted out as if the letter had been buried underground for decades. Inside rested a folded railway map, stained with dark watermarks and strange brown spots. Thin silver lines crossed through the Alps toward tunnels and stations that did not appear on any modern transit records. In the bottom corner, one phrase had been handwritten repeatedly in trembling ink: "Do not board after midnight." Elias spent the entire night studying the map, beneath the weak glow of his desk lamp. Every route connected to villages destroyed long ago by avalanches, fires, and disappearances. One station was circled so deeply the paper had nearly torn apart beneath the pressure of whoever marked it. The next morning, Elias visited the National Railway Archive, where he had worked for nearly 12 years. He searched every database, microfilm reel, and wartime transport record for the mysterious railway. Each search ended the same way, with missing files and references that appeared deliberately erased. An elderly archivist noticed the map, partially sticking from Elias's coat pocket near closing time. The old man's face instantly lost its color beneath the flickering fluorescent lights. Without another word, he quietly locked the archive door and whispered that the railway was never built for the living. Before Elias could question him further, the archivist hurried toward a storage corridor and vanished into darkness. Elias followed the sound of retreating footsteps until he reached a dead end lined with rusted cabinets. On the wall beside them, someone had scratched the same warning repeatedly into the paint: "Do not board after midnight." That night, Elias could not sleep despite the exhaustion clawing at his body. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard distant train whistles echoing through frozen tunnels beneath the mountains. At exactly midnight, the sound grew so loud that his bedroom glass trembled violently for several seconds. He rushed to the window, expecting to see police lights or passing traffic below the apartment. Instead, thick snow covered the empty street, while silence swallowed the entire city. Far below, however, he noticed a single set of fresh footprints leading toward the train station across town. The footprints ended beside an abandoned platform, sealed since the early 1970s. A frozen ticket booth stood nearby, with shattered windows coated in frost from the inside. Beneath the snow on the platform floor, Elias uncovered a metal railway emblem matching the symbol printed on the mysterious map. As Elias examined the emblem, a low mechanical rumble vibrated beneath his feet. The old tracks suddenly began to hum with faint electrical life, despite being disconnected for decades. Somewhere beyond the darkness, a train whistle screamed through the night with a sound almost human. A figure appeared at the far end of the abandoned platform, just as snow began falling harder around them. The stranger wore a black conductor's uniform covered in frost and stood completely motionless beneath the dead station lights. Then the figure slowly raised one pale hand and pointed directly toward the Alps. Elias barely slept before dawn swallowed the city beneath another storm front. The image of the silent conductor remained burned into his thoughts like a scar. By morning, he had already decided he would follow the map into the mountains. He packed only a few clothes, a flashlight, notebooks, and the mysterious railway map. Several co-workers tried warning him that the Alpine roads were becoming dangerous after the recent avalanche. Elias ignored them because curiosity now outweighed common sense. The drive toward the mountains grew darker, with every passing mile beneath the storm clouds. Snow gathered heavily along the roadside, while frozen forests stretched endlessly beside the highway. Occasionally, Elias caught glimpses of abandoned railway signs buried beneath drifts of ice. At a roadside gas station near the border, he showed the map to an elderly mechanic warming his hands near a heater. The man immediately crossed himself and refused to touch the paper. Before Elias left, the mechanic warned him never to follow tracks that appeared after midnight snow. The final road into the Alps vanished beneath walls of swirling snow that erased every sign of civilization behind Elias. His rental car crawled along narrow mountain paths while icy cliffs loomed like giant graves in the darkness. Several times he thought he saw figures standing among the trees, watching silently before disappearing into the storm. By dusk, Elias reached the isolated village marked on the strange railway map. Smoke drifted weakly from crooked chimneys, while old wooden houses leaned under heavy snow like exhausted mourners. Not a single child played outside, and every villager seemed to avoid looking directly at him. He entered the only inn still open, dragging melted snow across the creaking floorboards. Conversations immediately stopped when the villagers noticed the folded railway map sticking from his coat pocket. The silence felt unnatural, as though the entire room had suddenly stopped breathing together. An elderly waitress approached, carrying a cup of bitter black coffee with trembling hands. Without asking his name, she quietly warned him to leave before midnight reached the mountains. When Elias asked about the hidden railway, the woman dropped the cup onto the floor and backed away in terror. The innkeeper quickly pulled the frightened waitress into another room and locked the door behind them. Several villagers crossed themselves, while others stared at Elias with pity rather than anger. One old hunter finally muttered that the dead still traveled beneath the village whenever heavy snow covered the peaks. Elias rented a room upstairs, despite repeated warnings whispered through the crowded inn. Sleep never came because strange metallic noises echoed beneath the floorboards every hour after sunset. The sounds resembled distant train wheels grinding slowly against frozen tracks deep underground. Near midnight, Elias followed the noises outside with only a lantern and the ancient map guiding him. Snow hammered the empty streets, while freezing wind screamed through narrow alleys between abandoned houses. At the edge of the village cemetery, he discovered fresh footprints leading toward the old chapel on the hill. The chapel looked abandoned for decades, with shattered stained glass and a roof sagging beneath thick ice. Yet warm candlelight flickered faintly behind the cracked wooden doors despite the late hour. Elias stepped inside and found the chapel completely empty, except for rows of dusty pews facing a blackened altar. As Elias explored the silent building, he noticed strange symbols carved beneath layers of peeling paint. The markings matched symbols printed along the railway routes on his mysterious map. Then he heard a hollow metallic clang echo somewhere below the chapel floor. He searched the altar until his trembling hands uncovered a hidden iron ring beneath a rotting carpet. With enormous effort, Elias pulled open a concealed trapdoor, releasing a blast of freezing air from below. Stone steps descended into darkness so deep the lantern light barely touched the first few stairs. The underground tunnel smelled of rust, coal smoke, and something far worse hidden beneath both scents. Elias descended carefully, while melted snow dripped from the ceiling like slow falling tears. Far below, dim electric lights suddenly flickered alive one by one without any visible power source. At the bottom of the staircase, Elias stepped into a massive underground railway station, frozen perfectly in time. Dust-covered benches lined the platform beside piles of ancient luggage, tagged with names long erased by age. Above the silent tracks hung a cracked station clock, permanently stopped at exactly midnight. The underground station remained deathly silent, while Elias stood frozen beneath the broken clock. Frost crept across the platform tiles, despite the stale underground air hanging motionless around him. Somewhere far inside the tunnels, metal wheels screeched faintly against unseen tracks before falling silent again. Elias lifted his lantern toward the abandoned luggage stacked beside the benches. Several suitcases carried faded travel stickers from countries that no longer existed on modern maps. One leather trunk still held a brittle train ticket stamped with a departure date from 1941. The station light suddenly flickered brighter without warning, bathing the platform in a pale yellow glow. Dust drifted through the air like ash, while the old electrical wires overhead hummed weakly. Elias realized the station no longer looked abandoned because something had awakened beneath the mountain. A distant whistle echoed through the tunnels, long and mournful like an animal crying in pain. The sound vibrated through the stone walls and into Elias's chest, hard enough to steal his breath. Then came the slow, rhythmic thunder of approaching train wheels somewhere deep underground. Fear clawed through Elias as he extinguished his lantern and hid behind a row of cracked pillars. The tunnel ahead glowed faintly with moving light, while thick black smoke rolled along the ceiling. Every instinct screamed at him to run, yet his body remained locked in terrified fascination. The train emerged slowly from the darkness like a beast crawling from its grave. Black steam poured from its rusted engine, while sparks burst violently beneath grinding iron wheels. Across the engine side, silver letters spelled out a name nearly erased by age: Noctis Line. As the train stopped beside the platform, every carriage window revealed motionless silhouettes sitting inside. Pale passengers stared forward without blinking beneath dim overhead lights. None of them spoke, moved, or acknowledged the freezing air surrounding the station. The carriage doors opened simultaneously, with a loud metallic hiss echoing across the underground chamber. One by one, figures emerged from the train carrying suitcases, umbrellas, and old winter coats coated in snow. Elias noticed something horrifying as they passed beneath the station lights. Every passenger looked slightly transparent, as though their bodies existed halfway between flesh and smoke. Some wore clothing from different centuries, while others carried wounds that should have killed them instantly. A man, missing half his face, calmly adjusted his gloves beside a woman with frozen blue skin. Elias watched in horror as the passengers silently lined up beside the platform clock. An invisible station attendant seemed to inspect papers that no living person could see. Each traveler carried a small white tag attached to their coat, displaying a date of death instead of a destination. The station suddenly fell silent again when a little girl stepped off the final carriage, holding a stuffed rabbit. Her white dress was stained dark red near the stomach, while melted snow dripped from her tangled hair. Slowly she turned her head toward Elias's hiding place and smiled knowingly. Before Elias could retreat, the child quietly pointed toward the train behind her. A new white tag now hung from the outside handle of the nearest carriage door. Written across the tag in faded black ink was Elias's full name beside tomorrow's date. Elias stumbled backward from the pillar while icy panic flooded every nerve in his body. The little girl continued staring at him with a smile far too calm for a dead child. Around them, the ghostly passengers remained silent, as though they had not noticed his terror. The white tag bearing his name swayed gently from the carriage handle, despite the still air underground. Elias tore it away with shaking hands and discovered another line written beneath the date. The message simply read, "Final boarding authorized by the conductor." A loud metallic clang echoed through the station before the train doors slowly began closing again. Desperate to escape, Elias sprinted toward the staircase leading back to the chapel above. The tunnel lights instantly shut off one by one ahead of him, swallowing the stairs in darkness. Then a cold hand suddenly wrapped around his wrist from behind the nearest pillar. Elias spun violently and found himself face to face with a pale young woman wearing an old-fashioned grey coat. Her dark eyes looked filled with exhaustion rather than malice, yet her skin carried the color of frozen marble. "You cannot outrun the railway once it marks you," she whispered softly through cracked blue lips. Her voice sounded distant, as though echoing through deep water beneath the mountain. Elias tried pulling away, but her grip remained impossibly strong, despite her frail appearance. The woman introduced herself as Helena, while guiding Elias away from the platform edge. She explained that she died during a blizzard nearly 80 years earlier, while crossing the Alpine pass with her family. The railway collected her soul before rescuers ever discovered her frozen body beneath the snow. As they moved deeper along the platform, Elias noticed dozens of shadowy figures standing silently near the tunnel walls. Some appeared burned beyond recognition, while others carried shattered limbs or hollow black eye sockets. Helena quietly explained that every soul there had died violently within the mountains surrounding the railway. Elias demanded to know why his own name appeared on the boarding tag, despite still being alive. Helena hesitated before revealing the railway had recently begun taking living passengers during severe winter storms. According to frightened whispers among the dead, the balance between life and death beneath the Alps was collapsing. The station lights dimmed again as a deep mechanical groan echoed from somewhere far inside the mountain. Helena's expression darkened with fear for the first time since meeting Elias underground. She warned him that the conductor was searching for replacements to keep the cursed railway moving through the tunnels. A sudden scream shattered the silence from inside one of the train carriages near the rear platform. Elias watched in horror as a terrified living man pounded desperately against the locked windows from inside the train. Ghostly passengers calmly stared at him, while blood slowly spread across the fogged glass. Before Elias could react, the rear carriage door creaked open by itself with painful slowness. A tall figure stepped onto the platform, wearing a black railway uniform covered in frost and ash. Where the man's face should have been, existed only endless darkness beneath the conductor's cap. The faceless conductor stood motionless, while steam curled around his boots like living shadows. Helena immediately lowered her head and whispered for Elias not to let the creature hear him breathe. Then the conductor slowly turned toward them, and somewhere inside that empty darkness, something smiled. The conductor glided across the platform without making a single sound against the frozen tiles. Thick steam coiled around his dark uniform, while the station lights flickered violently overhead. Elias felt his chest tighten as the faceless figure stopped only inches away from him. Helena kept her eyes lowered, while icy fear trembled through her pale hands beside him. The surrounding spirits slowly backed away from the platform as though terrified of attracting attention. Even the dead seemed frightened of whatever existed beneath the conductor's empty hood. "You boarded long before arriving here," the conductor whispered in a voice like grinding metal beneath deep water. The sound echoed unnaturally through the station and vibrated inside Elias's skull painfully. Elias struggled to speak while the creature tilted its head toward him in silence. The conductor slowly raised one gloved hand and pointed toward the tunnel behind the train. Suddenly, the stone walls around the station began shifting with ghostly images from decades earlier. Elias watched crowds of passengers screaming as smoke and fire consumed a railway tunnel beneath collapsing ice. Helena quietly explained that the disaster occurred during the winter of 1937. An avalanche buried an entire midnight train beneath the mountain, while hundreds remained trapped alive underground. Rescue crews never reached them because another storm sealed the tunnels permanently by morning. The conductor revealed that the railway had existed long before the catastrophe beneath the Alps. Hidden beneath the mountains ran ancient tunnels built to carry souls away from places touched by violent death. For centuries, the railway transported the departed peacefully until the collapse poisoned something deep within it. As the vision faded, Elias noticed shadowy hands pressing outward from cracks in the tunnel walls. Dozens of distorted faces appeared briefly inside the stone before vanishing into darkness again. Helena whispered that the trapped souls never reached the afterlife and now endlessly clawed beneath the mountain. The conductor walked toward the edge of the platform, while ancient wheels groaned somewhere below the tracks. He explained that the railway now required living passengers to replace those forever imprisoned within the buried tunnels. Without replacements, the trapped souls would eventually escape into the world above. Elias refused to believe the nightmare unfolding around him and demanded another way existed. For the first time, the conductor's posture shifted with what almost resembled amusement. The faceless entity explained that balance always demanded sacrifice, whether willingly given or violently taken. A deafening impact suddenly shook the station hard enough to crack the frozen pillars nearby. From deep within the blocked tunnels came endless screaming mixed with frantic pounding against buried train doors. Dust and snow rained from the ceiling, while terrified spirits scattered across the platform. Helena grabbed Elias desperately and warned him the imprisoned souls were growing stronger every winter. She revealed that the railway could no longer fully contain the dead trapped beneath the collapse. If the tunnels finally broke open, every nearby village would drown beneath an army of furious spirits. The conductor extended a pale ticket toward Elias through the swirling steam surrounding him. Across the black paper, silver letters revealed a final destination called Terminus Below. Then the creature quietly informed Elias that the train would depart in exactly 7 minutes, with or without him aboard. The train lurched forward before Elias could decide whether to flee or surrender to the nightmare surrounding him. Helena pulled him inside the nearest carriage moments before the platform vanished behind thick black smoke. Outside the windows, the underground station disappeared into darkness as though it had never existed at all. The carriage lights flickered weakly above rows of silent dead passengers, staring straight ahead. Frost coated the ceiling while melted water dripped steadily between the seats like slow falling blood. Elias noticed every window reflected endless darkness instead of the inside of the train itself. Helena whispered that no living person had ever reached the railway's final stop and returned unchanged. Her pale face looked weaker now, almost transparent beneath the dim yellow lights overhead. Somewhere farther down the carriage, someone quietly sobbed behind a locked compartment door. The train accelerated violently through twisting tunnels buried beneath the Alps. Metal screamed against metal, while ancient beams overhead cracked beneath impossible pressure. Several passengers began murmuring softly in forgotten languages, as though praying for mercy from something ahead. Elias looked through the window and suddenly saw entire cities buried beneath the mountain rock outside. Countless buildings stretched endlessly through underground caverns, illuminated by ghostly blue fire. Pale figures wandered the streets below, like shadows trapped between worlds without knowing they were already dead. Helena explained the hidden city was called Terminus Below by the railway workers long ago. It became a prison for souls abandoned after the avalanche trapped the midnight train beneath the mountains. Over decades, the dead built their own silent world beneath the Alps while waiting for release. A violent shudder passed through the train as distant explosions echoed ahead within the tunnels. Cracks spread across the carriage walls while black smoke poured through broken ceiling vents overhead. The trapped souls beneath the mountain had finally begun tearing open the buried railway. The conductor appeared suddenly at the end of the carriage, surrounded by swirling ash and steam. His empty hood faced Elias, while dozens of dead passengers slowly turned toward them together. In his pale hand rested another black ticket, this time bearing Helena's name. Helena stepped backward in horror and revealed the railway had promised her eventual freedom decades earlier. Instead, the conductor intended to sacrifice her soul permanently to repair the collapsing tunnels below. Elias realized the creature never planned to restore balance, because suffering itself kept the railway alive. The train burst from the tunnel into a colossal underground cavern filled with thousands of screaming spirits. Beneath the tracks stretched the ruined remains of the buried 1937 train, crushed beneath mountains of rock and ice. Skeletal hands reached upward endlessly from the wreckage, while the dead wailed through the darkness. Elias seized a rusted emergency brake near the carriage door, despite Helena screaming for him to stop. With all his strength, he pulled the lever downward while sparks erupted violently beneath the train wheels. The entire railway shook apart as the cursed engine screamed louder than any human voice could survive. The train derailed across the cavern in a storm of twisted metal, shattered glass and fire. Elias glimpsed Helena smiling sadly before the collapsing tunnel swallowed her and the conductor beneath tons of falling stone. When rescuers found Elias unconscious near the abandoned chapel days later, fresh railway tracks stretched across the snow behind him, leading deep into the mountains before disappearing completely. Months passed before Elias could speak about the nightmare hidden beneath the Alps. Doctors blamed his trauma on exposure, hallucinations, and the avalanche that nearly killed him. None of them understood why coal dust still appeared beneath his fingernails every midnight. He returned to the city, carrying scars no one else could see beneath his skin. Sleep became impossible because train whistles echoed through his apartment every night after dark. Sometimes the sound stopped directly outside his window before fading again into silence. Elias locked the railway map inside a steel cabinet at the archive shortly after returning home. Despite the heavy lock, he often discovered the cabinet standing open by morning. Each time, the map appeared slightly different, with new routes slowly spreading deeper across the Alps. One evening, the elderly archivist approached Elias near the basement records room with trembling hands. The old man confessed that he once saw the Noctis line as a child during another terrible winter. His father disappeared aboard the midnight train and never returned. The archivist revealed that strange deaths had begun occurring again near the mountain villages. Entire families vanished during snowstorms without leaving footprints behind in the drifts. Survivors claimed they heard train whistles moments before the disappearances began. Elias tried convincing himself the railway had been destroyed beneath the collapsing cavern. Yet every newspaper report from the Alps described unexplained tracks appearing beside frozen roads after midnight. Witnesses also described seeing a black steam engine crossing abandoned bridges during blizzards. Late one night, Elias discovered fresh snow covering the city streets outside his apartment. The storm had arrived unexpectedly, blanketing rooftops and alleyways in unnatural silence. Then a familiar whistle echoed faintly through the distance beneath the falling snow. Drawn by terror and curiosity, Elias followed the sound through the empty streets after midnight. The city looked deserted while old streetlights flickered weakly through the storm. His footprints became the only marks visible across the untouched snow. The whistle led him back to the abandoned station, where he first encountered the frozen conductor. This time the platform lights glowed dimly beneath layers of drifting ice. Fresh railway tracks now stretched across the platform, where rusted rails once ended decades earlier. A crowd of silent figures waited beside the tracks, carrying suitcases beneath the falling snow. Some looked human, while others appeared translucent beneath the station lights. Elias recognized several missing villagers from recent newspaper reports, standing motionless among the passengers. The black train emerged slowly through the storm exactly at midnight without making a sound. Steam curled through the frozen air, while carriage windows glowed pale yellow against the darkness. Across the engine's side, the silver letters of Noctis Line appeared newly polished. Elias noticed something horrifying as the passengers boarded the train in silence. Each carried a white tag displaying not their death date, but future dates that had not yet arrived. The railway was now collecting souls before death could even claim them naturally. A familiar little girl stepped from the final carriage, holding her stuffed rabbit against her chest. Her pale eyes locked onto Elias immediately through the falling snow. Slowly she pointed toward an empty seat, visible through one of the carriage windows. The carriage door beside Elias creaked open without anyone touching it. Warm air smelling of coal smoke drifted outward from the darkness inside the train. Somewhere deeper within the carriages, someone whispered Elias's name repeatedly. Fear rooted Elias to the frozen platform, while the passengers continued boarding around him. None of them blinked or acknowledged the snow melting across their pale faces. Every movement seemed controlled by an invisible force pulling them toward the train. Then Helena suddenly appeared beside Elias like mist forming from the storm itself. Her body flickered weakly, almost transparent against the station lights. She warned him the derailment had only wounded the railway rather than destroying it completely. Helena explained the conductor survived beneath the mountain by binding himself directly to the buried tunnels. Every soul taken by the railway strengthened his control over the dead trapped underground. The Noctis Line would continue hunting passengers until someone ended the conductor permanently. Before Elias could answer, the black train whistle screamed loud enough to shake the station windows violently. The surrounding passengers immediately turned toward him together with empty expressions. Somewhere inside the engine, something heavy began moving slowly toward the open carriage door. The conductor stepped onto the platform surrounded by swirling snow and steam. Cracks spread through the frozen ground beneath his boots, while darkness poured endlessly from his empty hood. This time, Elias could hear faint human screams echoing from inside the creature itself. "You belong to the railway now," the conductor whispered, while extending another black ticket toward Elias. The paper felt warm despite the freezing storm surrounding them. Across its surface, Elias saw a destination written in silver letters: Final Crossing. Helena grabbed Elias and dragged him backward, moments before skeletal hands erupted from beneath the snow-covered platform. The dead clawed upward through the ice, while passengers calmly continued boarding the train around them. Several screaming spirits wore railway uniforms buried beneath decades of frost. Elias realized the boundary between the living world and terminus below was collapsing rapidly. The station no longer existed entirely within reality after the derailment beneath the mountain. Every midnight, the railway pushed farther into the world above, searching for new souls. The conductor raised one gloved hand toward the storm-dark sky, without speaking another word. Instantly, every station light exploded, while distant train whistles echoed across the entire city. Windows shattered in nearby buildings as terrified screams rose from the streets beyond. Helena told Elias there was only one way left to stop the railway forever: The conductor's physical form needed to be destroyed inside the engine that carried the trapped souls forward. If the engine died, the tunnels binding Terminus below to the living world would collapse permanently. Knowing he might never return, Elias boarded the train while Helena followed close behind him. The carriage doors slammed shut instantly as the engine roared louder than thunder outside. Through the windows, the abandoned station vanished beneath endless swirling snow. The train accelerated through impossible tunnels that twisted beneath mountains and cities alike. Elias saw glimpses of drowned stations, burning villages, and shadow-covered graveyards beyond the windows. Time itself seemed distorted inside the railway as ancient clocks spun wildly backward. Passengers slowly turned their heads toward Elias, while the train raced deeper underground. Their hollow eyes reflected pale lights flickering across the carriage ceiling. Several mouths moved silently, as though begging him to save them from endless travel. Helena guided Elias through narrow corridors connecting the carriages toward the engine at the front. The farther they walked, the hotter the air became despite frost covering every wall. Distant screams echoed constantly through the metal floors beneath their feet. One compartment contained hundreds of white passenger tags hanging from the ceiling like dead leaves. Elias recognized names belonging to villagers, archivists, and even co-workers from the city. Near the center hung a fresh tag bearing Elias's own name once again. The train suddenly lurched violently as something massive struck the carriages from outside the tunnels. Cracks split across several windows, while ghostly hands reached inward through the broken glass. The trapped souls beneath the mountain were trying to drag the railway apart. Helena revealed the souls attacking the train were once innocent passengers, abandoned during the avalanche. Years of endless suffering transformed them into furious creatures, consumed entirely by rage. If freed into the living world, they would destroy everything across the mountains. At last, Elias reached the engine carriage where towering furnaces burned with unnatural blue fire. Human silhouettes writhed endlessly inside the flames, while chains rattled across the ceiling overhead. The conductor stood motionless beside the furnace, waiting silently in the darkness. The creature slowly removed its conductor cap for the first time since Elias encountered the railway. Beneath the hood existed not a face, but a swirling void, filled with screaming souls, trapped in eternal torment. Elias briefly saw Helena's family among the faces before the darkness shifted again. The conductor explained that the railway survived by consuming grief, fear, and violent death from humanity. Every tragedy within the Alps strengthened the tunnels connecting Terminus below to reality. As long as suffering existed, the Noctis line would always rebuild itself. Elias noticed a massive iron heart suspended above the furnace by rusted chains thick as tree trunks. The heart pulsed slowly, while black liquid dripped into the blue flames below. Helena whispered that the engine itself was alive and bound directly to the conductor. Without hesitation, Elias seized a heavy iron shovel near the furnace and climbed toward the suspended heart. The conductor erupted forward with impossible speed, while shadowy hands burst from beneath his cloak. Helena threw herself between them as screaming spirits filled the engine room. The train thundered wildly through collapsing tunnels, while Elias reached the rusted chains holding the iron heart overhead. Sparks exploded around him as the railway shook violently beneath another avalanche deep underground. Below, Helena struggled against the conductor, while darkness poured from his empty hood like smoke. Using every ounce of strength remaining in his exhausted body, Elias struck the chains repeatedly with the iron shovel. Metal snapped apart one link at a time, while the furnace roared louder beneath him. The conductor screamed with hundreds of voices at once as the heart began falling. The massive iron heart crashed directly into the blue furnace below in a storm of fire and shattered metal. Instantly, the engine carriage erupted with blinding light, while every trapped soul screamed together. The train derailed violently through the tunnels as the mountain itself began collapsing around them. Helena smiled one final time before her body dissolved into pale, drifting ash beside the flames. The trapped souls surrounding the engine slowly faded upward, like smoke finally released into open air. Even the conductor's endless darkness began tearing apart beneath the burning light. Elias awoke days later, in a rescue shelter near the mountains with severe burns covering his arms. Authorities claimed another avalanche destroyed several abandoned tunnels beneath the Alps during the storm. No one could explain why melted railway tracks stretched from the mountains into the city before vanishing suddenly beneath the snow. Years later, travelers crossing the Alpine passes still report hearing distant train whistles during heavy storms after midnight. Some claim to see pale passengers standing silently beside frozen roads before disappearing into the snowfall. Others swear black railway tracks briefly appear beneath the snow, leading toward tunnels that should not exist. Elias never returned to the mountains after surviving the collapse beneath terminus below. Yet every winter, he receives a blank envelope smelling faintly of coal smoke and damp earth. Inside waits a fresh black ticket bearing only 3 words written in silver ink: "Boarding soon again."